You can continue to make as many post-simulation tweaks as you'd like, and I'm always encouraging people to find new and interesting ways of fixing problems and adding detail. In my version of the shot, I didn't really like how this part at the top of the building here is perfectly intact. With so much of the building missing, I'd expect that top portion to kind of sag down a bit more. And you could do this either with soft constraints in the RBD sim or with post-sim tweaks, and I would highly encourage people to try out both techniques, but in my case I just went with the post-sim solution. A few soft transforms on some proxy driver geometry took this kind of stiff looking building here and made it look a lot nicer with this more collapsed look here. It's really quite a lot of detail and realism added just with a simple sculpted shape. In this particular case, I just brought in the proxy geometry and split out the top section that I wanted to sag down a bit, and I converted that to VDBs, reshaped that and smoothed it a little bit to make some nicer proxy geometry, and then converted that to polygons. And then I just used a couple soft transforms to sag that down and to compress it a bit more, and then used a blend shape to control the animation of that sagging. And instead of just point deforming the top section of our building, I actually used this proxy geometry to deform the entirety of our sim points here. And sometimes these little hacks can cause some problems. For example, in my case, doing that point deform on the top of the building caused one piece to look like it was floating, so I just added an extra transform for that piece and then used an animated blend shape to dial that in, and you can spend as much time as you want tweaking these things. It's also worth noting that when I sagged down the top of this building, I wanted to update the active frame value as well, because if I'm generating some dust and debris and window shatters based on when these pieces activate, I want to take that sagging animation into account as well. And as I've mentioned before, don't feel like everything needs to be perfect. You don't have to go in and hand animate every problematic piece because so much of this will be covered in dust. I would just focus on the parts that are very obvious and really catch your eye, and perhaps delay some of your tweaks until after you do the secondary elements if possible. Once you have a version of the sim that you like, you can run a final cache of those simulation points, and then after this cache, I usually like to use a time shift to clamp it to the valid time range of that cache. So on this time shift, I'll turn on this clamp to both, and this clamping will default to your time slider, but I want to channel reference that to the start and end frame of the actual file cache parameters. So for that file cache start, I'll copy that and paste the relative reference into the time shift start. And I'll do the same thing for the end frame. And I usually run both my simulation and my caches for a few extra frames beyond the actual end frame, just in case we need to do any motion blur fixes. If you just cache right up to the very end of your shot, then sometimes you get a little bit of motion blur weirdness at the first and last frames. So that's why I'm going to 1153 here. And now we're just caching these whole frames, so right now we don't have good subframe data. If you want to check the subframe data of your points, you can pull up your time settings here, turn off the integer frame values, and set it to some decimal step. In my case, I'll set it to just 0.1 and then close that. And if you step through your sim, you'll see that as I'm stepping through this here, it's not smoothly interpolating between frames. It's just jumping from frame to frame. And we always want to make sure that our subframe data is smooth. So to fix those subframes, I'll add in a time blend and hook the time shift clamp to that. And this evaluation mode, I'll set to by frame. And for that input frame range, I'm just going to copy that reference from our file cache once again. So copy that start frame and paste the relative reference in here. And I'll do the same thing for the end frame. And this has settings for how to handle frames outside of the valid range. This says to hold it beyond the first frame or extend it past the last frame. So maybe we don't really need that time shift clamp and we can just get away with this retime alone, but I'm just in the habit of using that time shift clamp. You can feel free to just use the retime and see if that works if you'd like. And in here I'm going to turn on this interpolate rotation of normals, quaternions, and transforms. I'm going to leave off this use velocity option, and you may have noticed that I'm actually deleting the velocity data from the simulation points when I merge them with the static points. And that's because when I render this with motion blur, I'm just going to use interpolated blur instead of velocity blur. On this retime, I'm also going to set this point ID to name, although things should still work without that point ID set. And now if we step through our frames, you can see that as we step through all of these subframes, everything is smoothly interpolating. And once we apply these transforms to our actual proxies or fracture pieces, you'll see those transform matrices smoothly interpolating for some nice subframe motion. So now that we've verified that that's working correctly, I'll set the integer frame values back on our time settings here, and I'll set up a null for our final simulation points. I'll call this out final sim points and hook that up to our retime. And now that we have our final sim points sorted, we can set up our transform pieces as we've seen before, and you can directly render the transformed fractured geometry. I'm pulling in this fracture from our week 4 bullet sim with constraints setup, and this is just, the rest pose of that fracture geometry. And yeah, this can be rendered directly. We have the proxies hooked up in the exact same way. This is very helpful for use as colliders in any secondary sims, or if you want to do just maybe some quick preview renders of just to set this up. Maybe you want to set up some render settings just with your proxy geometry without waiting for all of the high-res geometry at render time. And there are lots of reasons for using either the proxies or the final version, and you have both of those available here. At this point, I would also run an alembic cache on our high-res geometry if this needs to be sent to a lighter using a different software. Perhaps this alembic format will be replaced by another preferred format soon, but at the moment, alembic is the most consistent format usable between different software packages. And for this project, that's what the lighter needed on his end. And a quick note about these alembic settings. I typically turn on this build hierarchy from attribute option using the path attribute, at least when we have a nice asset that we want to preserve that path hierarchy for. And under the geometry tab, this packed transform setting is very important. Most of the time, things will work when you have them set to transform geometry, at least for standard RBD sims. If you have proper deforming geometry, then you'll need to set that to deform. And this merge with parent transform can work nicely, but it's much more sensitive to how the path attribute is constructed if you use that option. I also had to make a few tweaks to the static portion of the building. You can see there's this rooftop section that sticks out here, and it looks a little bit weird for this intact roof to stick out where there's that hole in the RBD sim. So to cut a Boolean section out of there, I actually drew in a curve and transformed those edge points out a little bit to ensure that it's a full cut and not just a partial cut. And I used a poly extrude to build some cutters and then just chopped out that section of the roof. And I also had to sag this down a little bit. So I object merged in these deformers from above that we used to apply the sag to our main RVD pieces and brought them down to this static setup as well. But instead of just using these deformers directly, I also brought in this ring from the roof of that static portion of the building. If we just used this deformer here for this entire rooftop, that point deform could get a little bit weird in this area further away from this deformer. So including this ring as a point deform influence ensures much nicer results. It also helps us to preserve the shape a little bit near this little thing in the middle there, which in my opinion is much nicer because it looks a little bit weird if the roof stretches around too much without factoring in this large piece of geometry in the middle. So then, with that merged in with our main deformer here, we can then point deform that section of the roof. And I've also applied a delta mush to kind of smooth out some of those deformations. That's really an optional step. And then finally, you can export this as a deformable alembic cache. You could potentially cache this deforming roof with the rest of the static building geometry in one cache, but sometimes I like to keep things as efficient as possible, and since the rest of this building is not moving, we can just cache that out as a single frame static alembic, and then we only have to cache this one little piece as a proper deforming alembic cache, which is a bit heavier and slower. Not terribly slow for such a simple low resolution piece of geometry, but it's still a bit more efficient this way, caching them out separately, and then merging those alembic caches back together for render. That said, if you are staying in Houdini for a render, I really wouldn't bother caching out to alembic. I would just keep it as BGeo because it's a much more flexible and reliable format when staying within Houdini.